All right, thanks for your patience, everybody. We might kick off. How are we going for sound? Soundman's happy? Up the back's happy, that's good. All right, I'd like to start firstly by acknowledging the Larrakia people, the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to acknowledge members of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community who may be joining us here today. My name's Tony Grubb. I was the Census Field Director for Northern Australia, so through to about the end of last year. And since that time, prior to the release of data that I'm assuming a lot of you have already started to have a bit of a look at, processing was done down south. And Tracy Chester next to me is our co-presenter today. Tracy's the director, one of our directors in census processing. She's looking a little bit relieved now. Clearly a very big job. All right, so as a country, people have inhabited Australia for something like 50,000 years, although as we know there's been a bit of media report recently from Jabiru suggesting that might be as long as 65,000 years. But in terms of census, the last one just gone was our 17th. So we're planning today just to give a bit of a snapshot. There's a bit of a mix between a national picture and one of the territory. Some of it's also then tailored towards Darwin, and come Friday we're doing another similar presentation down in Alice Springs. So both Tracy and I are happy to take questions at the end of the presentation, probably make the flow happen a little bit easier if we do that way, and more than happy to take any questions via email, etc. after the event. Just to confuse matters, my email is actually anthony.grubb@abs.gov.au rather than Tony. That's just to keep you on your toes, but I'm sure Tracy's yours is pretty self-evident. And we've got an E in Tracy now, so I've got that right. All right. I probably don't really need to sell census to you. I think by your very presence here today suggests that you're very keen to know about census and probably avid users of census data. Actually, I wouldn't mind an indication from the crowd of who might have already jumped on the net and got some data so far. Looking at least 50%, maybe more. Thank you, Nicole. I would have been a bit disappointed if you hadn't. So in terms of the value of the census, it's clearly it's a fundamental asset of the nation. It's used as a basis for which we revise our population estimates, which are then clearly important for the allocation of scarce resources in terms of funding, and also determining the number of representatives in Parliament, electoral boundaries and the like. But also in the power of the data, because it's actually that rich data set that allows you to do that very fine level analysis and comparison of small areas and small population groups for our policy planning, social and business research. You're probably also aware that's also very important in terms of the ability for us to actually match that with other data in terms of linking it to other data sets through integration techniques, with examples around health, migration and education data to provide in-depth and longitudinal insights. And going forward, this census, I think one of our challenges is to actually show that data integration story come next year, because a lot of you remember there was a fair bit of press last year around the ABS decision to retain name and address for 4 years, but clearly that's going to allow us far more power in terms of that data integration capability going forward. So we're very excited what the next 3 or 4 years will bring. So in terms of where we got to, so it's almost a year since we actually had our census night in August. We've processed something like 8.5 million household forms and 750,000 personal forms. Clearly, with our new digital first approach, we're really focusing on a high online response. It's very pleasing to be able to let you know that we got around 63.5% of our persons in private dwellings responding via an online mode, which is only a smidge under our 65% target going in, and that's very pleasing, which shows you in the end ultimately what the level of support that we had from the Australian people in terms of filling out their census returns. So we use something like 700 coding and processing staff, And that in itself has actually very much been driven down over the censuses that I've been involved, purely through automation. So there's a lot of automation now, something like 3 billion data transactions in terms of that processing, and really only, which still sounds a lot, but 23 million clerical actions in that process. So that's very much been driven down over time. I remember my first census in the 90s, we had something like 1,200 people processing and half the population. So you can see how technology really makes life quicker and easier, but it's effectively a very large undertaking to process that data within 12 months. So we're looking like we've produced about 68.9 million pieces of data. So that our July release, for those who've seen it, it's already very extensive. We've just got a little bit more data to come out in October. Our second release processing, which is generally just around our education, employment and population mobility topics. And when that comes out, then we'll have that full picture. So 2.8 million tables of data, predominantly all up on the web for free. Tracy at the end is going to go through more around our products and what's available, which caters from the sophisticated user down to the data novice. All right, so in terms of how do we go? Clearly there's always a couple of headline indicators that people look to in terms of looking at a quality census. And ultimately our response rate came in at around 95.1% nationally. So that was a little bit less than last census, only to the tune of about 1%. But in that, we had to be very careful that we're actually comparing apples with apples, and there was, with that change of mode this time, we did see some changes in some of that non-response that we did have, particularly with our new model. As you know, 80% of the country we used a mail-out model and encouraging that digital response. In that, we actually saw through our post-enumeration survey more of a tendency this time to actually classify a dwelling as a non-contact dwelling than unoccupied. So that in itself actually in itself pushes the non-response rate down, because our pool of the responding is higher than what it otherwise would have been if some of the households have been captured as unoccupied. So as I said, 63.3% did it online. That's actually a really positive aspect of quality, in terms of that we know the online form actually gives us better quality, courtesy of, it's sequencing people through questions one by one. It's actually telling you who the person is that you're answering for when you're doing the question. It's checking for blank fields and invalid responses as we go through. And that just adds up to more data editing being done on the spot rather than being waiting for our processing systems to follow up at the end. Oops, go back up. Another measure of our actually I should say around the non-response. So we did have a 95.1% for the country. For NT, that was about 91%. So that's traditionally we've always had a lower response rate in the territory, and that sort of mirrors the same sort of movement for the rest of the country this time. I know a lot of people in the room would be also very interested in the undercount of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. If I forget to talk about it later on the presentation, we did see that the undercount figure was pretty much similar to last census, so no great gains in that place. I think our overall national undercount for Indigenous was 17.5%, which is compared to 17.2% last census. We still don't know how that translates below national. It's not until late September that we actually release sub-national, so state-level undercounts for Indigenous people. But as an example, I think from the 17.2% for the territory last time, that equated, when the figures finally were released, to about 20% undercount for Indigenous for the territory. And we'll explain a little bit more about what that means a little bit later. So in terms of the net undercount, the national figures has come in at about 1.1% as a net undercount, compared to, I think, 1.7% last time. And I think for the territory, we're looking at about a 5% undercount versus, I think it was close to 7% last census. But again, we have to be careful in terms of comparing those big numbers, because what we found, as I said, that propensity for us to classify a dwelling as a non-contact rather than unoccupied, translated into seeing in some areas larger overcounts and larger undercounts, but the net effect was 1%, which is less, but you do need to understand the characteristics of how that is calculated. But ultimately, for the nation, a 1% difference between the census count and our estimate resident population. All right, so enough about process. Now we're going to talk a bit about the snapshot of Australia, and here it is. So then we go straight to the territory, sorry. So before we get on, I think we probably just need to make sure that when we're talking about some of these figures, you understand what geographies that we were talking about. A lot of the information we present today will be at what we call our statistical area 3 level. And this map here gives you a bit of an indication of what they are. We've got 4 SA3s in the SA4 of Darwin, so Darwin City, Darwin Suburbs, Litchfield and Palmerston, and then 5 in the rest of the NT, which is Alice, Barkly, Daly, Tiwi, West Arnhem, East Arnhem and Katherine. So a little geography lesson there to start. But clearly, you know, we put out data at a whole host of geographic levels, which you'll see on the website. The common ones being, you know, local government area, but we've also got additional information now down as low as mesh block, which is the building block of our SA1s. So headlines, in terms of population. So we counted 23,401,892 user residents of Australia on August 9, 2016. So this is an increase of nearly 9% since the last census, a doubling since 1966, and 4 times the Australian population that our centenarians grew up with during the 1920s. So we've seen that solid growth throughout that century. The census found 1.5 million children that have been born since the last census, and over 1.3 million that had migrated to Australia. We need to note that the census did not count Australians that were overseas on census night. There are over 600,000 of those. So in terms of more local, so we've seen Darwin, so the Darwin SA4, seeing a 13.5% in census compared to 2011. The rest of NT, you know, very modest growth of 0.7%. And overall for the territory, 8%. So again, just making it clear that, you know, this is not the official population estimate that comes through our estimate resident population figures, but clearly shows you very strong growth over that 5-year period. Oops. All right, so New South Wales still the largest state with nearly 7.5 million people counted in the census. Around twice the size of all of Australia at Federation, nearly a third of the Australian population today. Victoria, not far away, with nearly 6 million people. Tasmania reached the personal part of this census by passing 500,000 persons for the first time, but that is our smallest state. NT is our smallest jurisdiction in terms of number of people, so just under 229,000, obviously over a very large area as well. And that's our usual residence count. So in census, I think we actually counted about 30,000 more than that in census, courtesy of our very strong tourism and FIFOs and the like at the time. So the story there is effectively 80% of our population is made up of the 3 eastern mainland states and the ACT. So we see that all our states and territories have grown since 2011, with Tas and South Australia the best kept secrets with growth rates of 3% and 5%. That's got to be terminology from our census branch here that came from Tasmania. NT New South Wales and Queensland growing a little faster with growth rates between 8 and 9%. So that leaves us with a race for the fastest growing state between WA, Vic and the ACT. So we saw WA there running a good race, but ended up with 10.5%. But ACT came in next with 11.2% growth. Vic came in second with a 10.7%, and ACT topped the poll with 11.2% growth rate since last census. So a little bit around capital city growth. The great proportion of our population lives in cap cities, and we actually found since 2011 Darwin was the fastest growing of all the capital cities in census, with a rate of 13.5%, followed by Perth with 12.4%. We also, and you've probably seen a bit of press around this because the Victorians like to skite about it, but they have been talking about how Melbourne is actually catching up to Sydney. And it's funny with all the reports. By the way, the Victorians put it in the press, you think that's going to be happening sometime soon, but I think it's like 2048, isn't it? It's projected to catch Sydney. I suppose what this does show for Darwin is we are seeing an urbanising of the territory. We're seeing a higher growth in the Greater Darwin area, whereas we're seeing a lower or even sometimes negative growth in other areas of the territory. And right now we've got over around 60% of Territorians actually living in Greater Darwin. So a bit of a table now, again, as I mentioned, at our SA3 level, showing our growth across those different regions. At the person level, it looks like you can see there that Litchfield's come out on top. I think a lot of us probably understand why that might be. Courtesy a couple of big MPEX camps and the jail moving from Berrima to Litchfield certainly helped that. So a very large growth rate there. But in terms of dwellings, you'll actually see it was more modest and more aligned with Darwin City and Palmerston after that. But Darwin City itself went from almost 23 to almost 26,000, which is at Darwin City, that is, a 13.5% increase. The suburbs 4.2, and Palmerston clearly, very very strong growth there in the 5-year period with 22%. And pretty much the story elsewhere is fairly flat. East Darwin's probably the biggest drop, and that had a lot to do with the aluminium mine, etc. in Nullarbor. But in the end, they've actually seen a bit of a growth there in Katherine, 5%. So a little bit more around some of the population. We've actually got our regional population growth out this Friday in a publication, haven't we? So we've just missed that by a couple of days. We could have come here with a little bit more data on our estimate region population, but not quite out just yet. Population age and sex is out 28th August. And we've got an Australian demographic statistics, which actually includes preliminary estimates of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations, out on the 28th of September. So a little graph there about population growth for the territory since 1966. So we had only just over 50,000 people in the territory in 66. So in that time, the territory's grown around 4 times its size, to our current user residents of around 230. So territory population growth then, if you equate it out, averaged to around 1.6% per annum, slightly down on the previous 5 years, which was around 2%, and also slightly lower than the Australian average, which was 1.8. All right, now to get into a little bit more detail. We've probably all heard it. We are getting older. And the territory is actually no different. So this graph here winds us back to 1991, just to give you an idea what was happening in 1991. That was the year that the Simpsons were first screened in Australia. Boris Becker won the Australian Open, and Paul Keating became our Prime Minister. You'll see from the pyramid, we've got similar numbers of people in each of the 5-year age blocks below 44, and then smaller and smaller cohorts as the population got older. And so this is a traditional pyramid shape. So if we look at 1991 and now compared to 2016. So fast forwarding 25 years and our shape has shifted. And what our demographers call a bit of a middle-age spread, as you can see. We've gone that way and now we've got this big bulge in our middle. And now we've got similar proportions of the population age ranges right up to 59 rather than 44, and a noticeable dip below the age of 20. Our growth over 65 is noticeable. In 1911, we only had 1 in 25 people being over 65. In 2011, it was 1 in 7. And now in 2016, 1 in 6 of us are over the age of 65. There's 665,000 more Australians over the age of 65 than there were in 2011. And for Australia's oldest state, Tassie, it's now 1 in 5 of the population. A couple of other numbers there, 487,000 people now aged 85 years and over, making up 2.1% of all Australians, with women actually outnumbering men in this age group, with 63% being female. So it's not looking so good for us males. They're talking about if some of these trends continue, the demographers describe the future shape of the pyramid as a coffin. So you'll see it getting straighter. Another one now for the Northern Territory, so a little bit different. In general, the age distribution of the NT is younger than for the whole of Australia, with more people in their mid to late 20s and their 30s, in addition to more children under the age of 15 as a percentage of the population. In addition, more men of working age, which is not surprising as many men live in NT exclusively for work. Nearly 52% of the user residents of the NT are male. So we're actually certainly got a bias towards male in the territory. So median age in the NT, 32 years. Median age in Darwin, 33 years. Same in Alice Springs, whereas the median age for Australia is actually 38 years. All right, so a little bit of a snapshot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander data. So in this, the 50th anniversary of the referendum that ensured that Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were full included in the census. Close to 650,000 Australians identified as being Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander origin in the past census. So this is an increase of about 18% since 2011. Nearly 3/4 of that growth, eastern seaboard in New South Wales and Queensland. So 25% growth in New South Wales, 20% in Queensland. For the territory, we had a growth rate of about 3%. So that does appear a little soft and down about half of what it was the previous census. So as I mentioned, we still haven't got the full picture in terms of our undercount for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but clearly in the territory, when you have something like a non-response rate of 8% or so, and 25% of the population being Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, clearly you'll have a gap in terms of those counts when non-response is taken into account. So back in 1971, the census counted 120,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, meaning the population has increased fivefold in the last 50 years, and nearly tripled as a proportion of the Australian population. So of the 650,000, 91% were of Aboriginal origin, 5% were of Torres Strait Islander origin, and 4% were identified as being of both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander origin. Okay. A bit more detail there. Another age pyramid for us to have a bit of a look at. And you saw the Australian one before. So what we've got in the orange, we've got the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people showing they continue to be of a much younger age and profile and structure than the non-Indigenous population. In 2016, more than half, or 53% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were aged under 25. In comparison, almost 1 in 3 non-Indigenous people were aged under 25. The difference between the two populations also is marked in the 65 years and over group. The proportion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people aged 65 and over was considerably smaller than non-Indigenous people. So 1 in 20 or 5% compared to 1 in 6 or 16%. Since the 1996 census, median age for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people has been on the rise. 20 years ago in 1996, the median age was just 20. This increased to 21 in 2011 and increased again to 23 come census 2016. The median age for non-Indigenous people in 2016 was 38. So some good comparators there. So a bit of a table nationally, along with some of the figures I mentioned before. So of our 650,000 approximately, 33% in New South Wales, 7% Victoria, 29 Queensland, and we go on. For NT, the proportion of national Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders living in the territory as counted in census was 9%. And that equates to about 1.8% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders that live in Darwin and 7% that live in the rest of NT. So we had just under 1 in 10 people in Darwin identify as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, whereas just over half the population in the rest of the NT identified as Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander. So yeah, so the figures on the right is a proportion of the individual states' population, around 3% to 4% New South Wales, Queensland, 25.5% for the territory. So our attempt to actually graph that probably doesn't come out too well. Given we haven't got too many SA3s in the territory, it's probably just as easy to rattle them off. So in Darwin, close to 1,300 people identified as Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander in the census. Palmerston 3,700, Litchfield 2,300, Alice Springs 13,100, Daly Tiwi 11,000, East Arnhem 8,700 and Katherine 9,200. Does this come out? Oh, it doesn't come out too bad on the big screen. I thought it'd actually be useful to give a bit of an overview of where we've gone in terms of our dwelling count. So all the dwelling statistics we place that we put out are based on a place of enumeration basis, not the user residence that I've been discussing with the people counts. But you'll see some fairly marked growth in a few areas, particularly a strong growth in apartments. I can't see it on my screen, but if you look at the apartments, I think over 4 stories. Is it this one? No, I can't see. 5,000. My screen's too little. I can see this one down there. So if you look at Darwin City, in 2016, the number of apartments in a 4 or more block was 5,000, which compared to only 3,000 5 years ago. So that's an incredible growth rate in that cohort. We also see quite a number of caravans. You'll see for Litchfield is the top one there. So this is the Darwin SA4, something like 1,100 caravans. So clearly a lot of that's around our tourists and the like. But again, fairly stable from 2011. You'll also see some counts there for improvised homes, tents, sleepers out. Some of this information is also comes into the mix when we produce our homeless estimates, which will come out, I think, around November this year, where we put out very detailed homeless estimates using census data. Not sure there's any other take-homes on that one, maybe not. Another one I thought useful to show for the territory, and we probably haven't put this in some of our other seminars around the country, is the counts of people being captured in non-private dwellings. So this is our hotels, motels, staffing quarters of different sorts, hospitals, corrective institutions and the like. A couple of real key ones there when you look at the numbers, a very big increase in staff quarters. We've gone from, so excluding overseas visitors, we've gone from, 5,200, 9,400, so very strong. Clearly a lot of that driven in Litchfield through our staff quarters there, but also saw a very marked jump in Katherine, so I'm assuming that, not having the opportunity to go and see what that means because we haven't put out occupation industry data yet, but one would assume that's going to be defence personnel. But I think actually Alice seemed to be pretty stable in terms of the counts between 2011. We see immigration detention centres there drifting off the radar. We've also got a bit of a split there of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in these dwellings, and again, unfortunately you see high proportions of those in corrective institutions, and that aligns pretty well with our other stats that we put out on prisons and the like yearly. And generally hospital counts and that fairly stable. Bit of an increase in hostels and boarding houses though. So that'll also come into our homeless estimates publication in November. All right, so I'm going to swing to Tracy now. She's going to get into a little bit more of the detail around the characteristics of our nation. So pretty much I've covered a lot around the counts, and I'll be back a little bit again later to talk some more. Thanks, Tracy.
Sorry, I still have paper notes. I can't read off a computer screen, so bear with me as I do this. Hello everyone, welcome today. I'm here to present a bit more of a picture around the diversity of our nation and the Northern Territory. Australia is a very diverse nation, and we have over 180 countries of birth and over 300 ancestries that have been identified in the 2016 census. On your left in this graph, you'll actually see the national picture, and we're actually sort of approaching that tipping point where we're soon to have more people that were either born overseas or have at least one parent born overseas. So in 2016, this was at 49%, and as this trend and migration patterns continue, I would be expecting at the next census that we'd have more first and second generation migrants in Australia than what we do our third generations. So our first generation migrants are those people that have identified that they were born overseas, and our second generation migrants are people who have stated that at least one of their parents was born overseas. Sorry. And new for the census in 2016, and we haven't collected this information for about 20 years, is that we actually collected detailed country of birth for the parents. So rather than just having Australia and overseas, we actually have the overseas country that those parents were born in. And a little bit of a fact for those that had parents that were born, at least one of them were born overseas, it was more likely that the mother was Australian born and that the father was overseas born than the other way around. So the NT picture is a little bit different. So on your right, you'll see the NT picture, and you'll actually find that we have a lower proportion of those first and second generation migrants, but in Darwin, the picture is actually quite a little bit different again. So Darwin actually reflects more of the national picture in that it's about half first and second, half third. But for the rest of the NT, you're looking at about 80%, close to 80% that are actually third generation Australians. All right. So where do our 6.2 million people who were born overseas actually live in Australia? New South Wales is really still the most popular destination for our migrants, with about 2.1 million migrants living there, or this is about a third of the overseas born population. So, and of course our eastern states are also very popular destinations in terms of actual numbers. But if you were to look at sort of the proportion of the state's populations, we actually find that WA has the highest proportion of overseas born population at about 32%, compared with 28% for the NT and Victoria. At the other end of the spectrum, and it always unfortunately seems to be Tassie at the other end of the spectrum, we just find that 12% of their population were born overseas. For the NT, we had 45,000 people, or 20% of our population, who were born overseas, and this is like a 29% growth rate compared with the 2011 figure. So if you sort of counteract that with a 3% growth rate in our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population, whereas for our overseas born population, that growth rate is 29%. So where do the migrants live in the NT? Well, you know, migrants are very attracted to our capital cities in general, and in fact I think a lot of the headlines around Sydney and Melbourne were about their large volumes and proportions of their population that are overseas born, and the trend is the same here in the NT. They're coming to Darwin more so than the rest of the state. And in fact, for the two statistical SA3 areas, gosh, that's boring statistical speak, isn't it? Darwin City and the Darwin suburbs, there were about 25,000 migrants who lived there. There's also a relatively large cohort that also live in Alice Springs too, and there's about 6,000 people that live in that SA3 area. So this graph shows really some of those big key changing migration patterns over the last 50 years for Australia. 50 years ago, in 1966, some of us may remember, not myself, but there were 18% of our population were actually born overseas, compared to 28% now. A third of these people, so roughly a third, 32%, came from England, and only 1.6% came from India and China combined. Now we're moving forward to just last year, and the picture is quite different. So while England is still our most popular country of birth for those born overseas, its proportional share of the overseas population has reduced quite a bit. So it's gone from 32% down to 15%. And we've also seen some quite marked increases in our Chinese-born and Indian-born populations, increasing to sort of 8% and 7% respectively. In the NT, we're sort of keeping that same trend that's happening at the Australia level, and we are seeing a reduction in those migrants that are coming from those European-based cities, countries even, and an increase in the proportional share of those coming from Asian countries. So we see that same reduction in the English-born for the NT as we saw for Australia, and in this graph, Greece sort of replaces the Italy story that was on the Australia level graph. In 2016, what's interesting though is that our top country of birth in the territory was actually the Philippines, so it wasn't the UK that is seen in a lot of the other states and territories. We've also seen India increase their proportional share of the overseas born population, and they're now fourth, following New Zealand, and New Zealand had a little bit of a decline compared with the last census. However, the Chinese born are yet to discover the wonderful place that is here in the territory, and I've been very fortunate to live here myself, so I know what it's like. They don't sort of appear on any of our stats, but they're more likely to live in New South Wales, Victoria, or Sydney and Melbourne. For Greater Darwin, the picture is very similar to the NT. We have 63% of our population are Australian born, and compared with 69% for the NT, 67% for Australia, and those top countries reflect those countries here that are on the graph as well. Story is a little bit different when you sort of look at some of those other areas outside of Darwin. So as I've sort of already alluded to in some of those earlier graphs, we've had that change in migration patterns, and that's been particularly evident over the last 10 years. So this graph sort of shows the country of birth for those recent migrants that have arrived in Australia in the last decade. These 5 countries make up nearly half of Australia's recent migrants, and England is the only European country that is in that list. So we've actually really seen that dramatic shift from European migrants to Asian-born migrants coming into Australia. If we think about it in terms of that proportional share, in 2001, just over half, 52% of our overseas-born population came from European-based countries. That's reduced down to 34% in 2016. Conversely, our Asian-born migrants have increased from 24% to 40% over that same time. So, NT, the story is the same in terms that it's those Asian countries that are coming here, but it's the sort of different Asian countries. So for us, the Philippines are quite large, India, England's still there in terms of our recent migrants. So while the Chinese haven't quite cottoned on to the great place that is the territory, the Nepalese have, and they slip in at number 5. And just because we love age pyramids, because we're statistical nerdy people and they tell a great story pictorially, this graph I think really shows that what the result of that changing migration pattern has really had on the country. So the blue graph, which is, as what Tony said, a traditional coffin-shaped sort of graph, is our European-born population. So a lot of our European-born migration really happened after World War II, sort of leading up into the 70s and 80s, after sort of declining after that. So like the rest of us, once they got here, they age, they're getting older, and they're not getting those younger cohorts through to sort of replace some of their population. And so you see that ageing effect happening for those guys. The European-born population median age is actually 59 years. And when you compare that with our Asian-born migrants, their median age is 35 years. So they still have that quite young traditional age pyramid happening there. So as I mentioned earlier, we have over 300 ancestries that were actually reported on the 2016 census, and Ancestry gives us an indication of a person's cultural group that can't be captured necessarily by country of birth or parents or the languages they speak. Now, for some people, they may choose to sort of select their ancestry just based on what their grandparents, and for a lot of other people, like myself, I thought, I'm Australian. That's a given, so I won't write that, and I went back many generations to sort of put my non-Australian ancestry on the census form. So European ancestries still dominate our list, so that shift in the Asian-born, that'll take a while to come through and filter out and come up into our top 10 for our ancestries. So of the top 10 ancestries in Australia, 7 of them were European countries, with the exceptions being people who identified their ancestry as Australian, Chinese and Indian. Nearly a third of the Territorians indicated their ancestry as either being Australian or Australian Aboriginal, while other common responses were from Europe. And that's really reflecting those third generations Australians that we have here, and a lot of people probably tend to be reporting their roots back to England or Scotland or Ireland as such. For Greater Darwin, story was a little bit different. We didn't really have a lot of people who identified as Australian Aboriginal, and as Tony sort of mentioned in his statistics before, in terms of the total numbers, there isn't a lot who identified as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander living in Greater Darwin compared to the rest of the NT. So we actually found that the ancestries really were Australian, well, for the top 5, Australian, English, Irish, Scottish, and the 5th one being German. So Australia is probably known very well overseas for its broad or its quite ochre accent, but I think we're also going to be recognised for being a very diverse nation with a diverse, given the diversity of the languages that we speak. There were over 300 separately identified languages that were identified in the 2016 census. More than 1/5 of Australians indicated that they spoke a language other than English at home. And Mandarin, for Australia, Mandarin was the most common language spoken outside of English being spoken in the home. English proficiency is always an important indicator as well, because as people would know, if you can't speak English very well, you can have barriers around accessing healthcare or just even services that you require. But what we found in the census was there was about 3 to 4% of our population recorded that they did not speak English at all. So 3 or 4% of 23.4 million, still quite large, but proportionally quite small. The greater diversity of languages spoken in the homes of Territorians really reflects not only the greater proportion of our Indigenous population, so we have 25% of our population who are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, but also the differences in the countries of birth of our overseas born population as well. So we actually find that a smaller proportion of the NT population spoke only English at home, whereas we have 3 Indigenous languages in our top 5, which are Creole. I did learn this word this morning, so please apologise if I mispronounce it, but Jamba Punyu. Thank you. I've been practising. And Walpiri as well. And of course, Greek also up there. Greece is a very popular country of birth for us, and Tagalog for those born from the Philippines. Again, we're finding that the English proficiency of our Territorians is very similar to that in Australia, in that only around 3% notified that they could not speak English. In Greater Darwin, the languages that we speak are a little bit different to the NT, only because of we don't have any of those Indigenous languages in our top 5 responses. Our top 5 responses other than English were Greek, Tagalog, Mandarin, Filipino and Indonesian. So religion has been getting quite a bit of press nationally around what's happening. And as far as I'm aware, ABS Census is the only source for this information in Australia. And I think a lot of countries around the world are a bit envious of the fact that we're able to collect this information on our census. So 50 years ago, Australia was predominantly a Christian country. Close to 90% of us reported that we had a religious affiliation, a Christian religious affiliation, and less than 1% of us reported either another religion other than Christian or no religion at all. Just last year, while Christian is still our predominant religious group, its share has really declined down to just over half of us, whereas 30% of us, nearly a third of us, are actually reporting that we have no religious affiliation. We've also seen an increase in the other religions, and the most popular responses there were for Islam. 2.6% of Australians reported that they had an affiliation with Islam, and 2.4% noting that they had an affiliation with Buddhism. Now, just as some extra information for everyone, the religious question on our census isn't optional. It's the only optional question that we have. So people can choose to not answer it if they want. And our non-response rate for this question on our 2016 census was just over 9%. But if you actually take out the imputed people that we added into the census, it actually comes down to just 4.3%. So 4.3% of those who actually responded to the census chose not to answer that question, or may have just accidentally missed it. We also did change the ordering of the response options for the religion question this time round. It's something we do with all our questions following every census. So for country of birth and languages, we look at the top responses, and for the top 7 or top 5, depending on how much space we have, we just make sure they reflect the most populous answers from the census before. In 2011, no religion was actually our second most populous response to the religion question, but it didn't make sense adding it in to say Catholic, no religion, Anglican. That sort of didn't make sense. So we just decided to put it up first, moving it from the bottom of the list from 2011. And so it was probably more front and centre in people's minds this time around than what it has been in the past. For the Northern Territory, 57% of our population reported that they had a Christian religion. So this is slightly higher than the national average of 52%. Similar rates for no religion. So in the NT, that was around 29%. And we actually had a 16% not stated figure here in the NT for the religion question, compared with 9% nationally. For Greater Darwin, it's a slightly different picture. We're still, and more similar, I guess, to the Australian picture, in that 53% of us reported a Christian religion, so lower than overall in the NT, and slightly higher proportions of people living in Darwin recording that they didn't have a religious affiliation, so 33% of people in Darwin do not have a religious affiliation. This graph's quite interesting. So I've just got the national picture here, but it's sort of trends that we're seeing over all states and territories, and it's sort of showing the religion picture split up by age. So what we find is that young adults, so those aged 18 to 34, were just as likely to report a Christian religion as they were to report no religion. And they're also the age group that was more likely to report an other religion other than Christianity. Older people, so those over the age of 65, they're much more likely to report that they had a Christian religion than any other age group. And the religious pattern for those under the age of 18 seems to reflect the patterns of those aged 35 to 49. And we suggest this is more of a form effect, as, you know, mum or dad's filling out the census form and answering on behalf of the entire family. So they're answering how they want that question to be answered for their children as well. So we think that's sort of really the story that's driving that age difference for our our children, our youth, just reflecting their parents' affiliation. In 2016, some little highlights and facts for our Christian religion. It was the Brethren and the Latter-day Saints that had the youngest age profiles, with more than half of their population being under the age of 35 years. The Catholic population was also relatively young. 44% were aged less than 35 years in 2016. And while there is some differences in the rates of men and women affiliated with Christian denominations, women were more likely than men to report having a Christian affiliation, sort of about 55 to 50%. For some of those other religions, it was the Sikhs who had the youngest age profile of those other religions, and they're with almost 3/4 of them aged less than 35 years. Those who affiliated with Islam and Hinduism also had a young age profile, with about 2/3 of their population under the age of 35. And comparatively, for a religion such as Judaism, it was 38% that were reporting that they were under the age of 35. And overall, for no religion, men were more likely to report no religion than women, so 32% versus 28%. There were some differences in the age profile though for those groups. So before the age of 25, men and women sort of reported the same rates of having no religion, but after the age of 35, we actually found that more men were reporting no religion compared to females, and then sort of reducing again in those older age groups. So I'm just going to hand back to Tony now as he takes us through some more family and household characteristics. Thank you.
Thanks, Tracy. All right. It's a bit of a snapshot here of families and households. In terms of the composition of our families, couple of families with children made the most common type of Australian family in 2016. However, the proportion of Australian families they make up has actually decreased over time. So in 1991, we had 54% of families were couples with children, dropping to 45% in 2016. So that's almost 9 to 10% drop in that period. The proportion of couple families without children and single parent families has increased since 1991. In 1991, 32% of Australian families were couple families without children, increasing to 38% in 2016. Similarly, single parent families have increased from 13% of families in 1991 to 16% in 2016. Some 900,000 single parent families were counted in 2016, and over 80% of single parents were female. Quite a stark percentage there. Almost 1/4 of households were occupied by one person, only one person in 2016. This increased from 20% of households in 91. So of the 2 million people living alone on census night, over half, or 55%, were female. Women living alone tend to be older than men who lived alone. The median age of females living on their own was 64 years compared to 54 years for males.
Does the people per household figure, does that include share housing or is it just families? Like, for example, young people in share houses?
Yeah, they wouldn't come through as families, would they? They'd be other households. Comes in the average persons per household, yeah. But not, yeah, wouldn't be covered in these family stats that I'm talking about. Yeah, thanks. Oops, sorry. Lost my spot. Technology. So in 2016, we counted 6.1 million families across Australia. And there was a little change in the composition of Australian families between 2011 and 2016, although there has been a considerable change in the 25-year period since 91. So if we look at some of, sorry about that. If we look at some of the figures for the territory in comparison, couples with children, 46.2% versus the national 44.7%. Couples without children, 35%, a bit lower than the national 37.8%. Single parent families, slightly more than the national average at 16.6%. And our people per household, 2.9. And I think so the average persons per household nationally is actually 2.6. So our average persons per household in the territory is higher than the national average, which would be expected. A little bit more around same-sex couples. So in 2016, we counted 46,800 same-sex couples across Australia. This is an increase of 39% since 2011. Female same-sex couples made up just under half, or 49% of same-sex couples. However, they were more likely to have children than male same-sex couples. So some 1/4 of female same-sex couples had children, whereas that was only 4.5% for same-sex male couples. The median age of people in same-sex couples is 40 years, considerably lower than the people in opposite-sex couples at 48 years. So clearly you can see, the trend from 1996 there is the percentage of male same-sex couples and female sex couples coming a lot closer together over time. So same-sex couples is a proportion of all couples. So same-sex couples accounted for close to 1% or 0.9% of all couples in Australia, which is up from 0.7% in 2011. In 2016, same-sex couples accounted for 1.4% of all couples in the ACT, 1.1% in New South Wales, 1% in Victoria. In each state except the Northern Territory, same-sex couples accounted for the greater proportion of couples in the capital cities and of couples outside of capital cities. So you see the territory there. So among the capital cities, the proportion of same-sex couples was highest for Canberra and Sydney, 1.4 and 1.2, and lowest for Adelaide and Perth, both 0.8%. So in terms of lone person households, so in 2016, 2 million people were living alone, 1.1 of them were women, and 0.9 million were men. Overall, 8.7% of Australians live alone, 9.3% of women, and 7.9% of men. The peak age groups for living alone, people aged 75 and over, and people aged 85 to 89 were most likely to be living alone, almost 1/3. Fairly low rates of living alone among younger people, but it starts to increase from age 45 for men and 50 for women. So same figures now for the territory. So we're seeing smaller proportions of the NT population living alone, but of course we are a younger population. Compared with Australia overall, the difference between our older men and women is a lot smaller. So you're seeing that big curve there. So Census also asks the questions around need for assistance with core activities. The data show that 1.2 million Australians have a need for assistance, or 5.1%, and this was 4.6% back in 2011. In 2016, slightly lower rates in older age groups are offset by increases at the younger age, particularly in the 5 to 19 year age groups. The need for assistance jumps rapidly from age of 85. Just over half of women aged 85 plus have a need for assistance with a core activity. In the Northern Territory, about 1,700 or 8.4% of males and 2,100 or 11% of females over the age of 55 require assistance with core activities. In 2016, 2.1 million Australians provided unpaid care or assistance to another person because of a disability, long-term illness or problems related to old age. Of these 1.3 million, of the 2.1 million, 1.3 million were women, 850,000 were men. So in the Northern Territory, we had 9% of people providing unpaid assistance to a person with a disability in the last 2 weeks, reported in Census. So what's that? Try to do the comparison. I can't. So the peak age groups for providing care were from the 59 to 75 year group. For women aged 50 to 64, more than 1 in 5 were providing care. And these are still working age years. In most age groups, women were much more likely to provide care than men. But this changes at the age of 80, where men have higher rates than women. $1.5 million people in 2016 reporting providing unpaid care for a child other than their own. Almost 1 million of the 1.5 million were women, 500,000 being men. Peak age groups are for women, for people in their late 50s and to early 70s. Clearly a demand there on grandparents. Almost one in four women in their 60s spent time providing care for a child. For men in the peak age group from 65 to 69, 14% of men in the age group provided care. So there's a plug for granddads. Okay, So in the Northern Territory, 29.4% of all people provide unpaid care for a child or children, including their own. That's quite high. This one's always a good topic around the dinner table. So unpaid domestic work. Us blokes have to take a backward step here. So in terms of no hours, you see quite skewed. So no hours and less than 5 hours of unpaid work, quite heavily skewed towards males, well over 20% in each of those categories. 11.5% of women do 30 or more hours work compared to 3% of men. So 30 versus 3. 13% of women do 15 to 29 hours of unpaid work compared to 5.5% of men. I have to stop reading these figures. It's a stitch up. Anyhow, 21% of men do no unpaid work compared to 14.5% of women. So, shall move on. Figures not too dissimilar here in the Territory. It's pretty much the same as what's been already told at the Australian level. All right, not too far to go now. In terms of median personal incomes, a bit of a graph there that paints a fairly strong story. So our income, we collect it at personal, household and family level. So median personal income across Australia was $662, while the median household income was $1,438. So you see here that we've got the highest median personal income being in the ACT of almost $1,000 a week, $998. But the Territory runs second there at $871. And I won't go through the others. A few notes now around housing and rent affordability. We are missing one slide here that I'll probably bring a few figures to your attention to paint a bit more of a picture in terms of our housing tenure. So in Australia, 31% of people report having owned a house outright, so 31%. In the Territory, that's only 15.3%, and 16% in Greater Darwin. So 31 nationally versus 15. On the own with a mortgage, reasonably similar figures, so 34.5% nationally owned with a mortgage, 35% in Greater Darwin, about 30% in Northern Territory. But another big stark difference along with owned outright is rented. So tenure for nationally, 30.9% of people rent, but in the Territory it's 50.3%, and in Darwin 44.4%. So there's some figures there just to put home tenure in context. So in terms of mortgage repayments, so the Australian median mortgage repayment calculated from Census was $1,755 a month. Mortgage repayments being highest in Darwin, Sydney, ACT and Perth. However, a high proportion of households in Perth, Sydney and Melbourne spend more than 30% of their income on their mortgage. Almost 1 in 10 households in Perth spend over a third of their income. So I won't go into those figures much more to show you the next slide, which paints more of a picture. So if we compare the changes from 2011 to 2016 in three measures, and whether it's household income, median mortgage or median rents, if we're looking at mortgage repayments, you're seeing as a percentage of a third for Darwin here, dropping quite off. So whilst Darwin's got amongst the highest percentages, the highest rates for mortgage, as a percentage of income, it actually drops away. So it actually shows you that mortgage affordability is actually better here than it is reported better here than in other states. So in Darwin, 6.8% of people reported spending more than 30% of their income on mortgage repayments. Similar story around rents. So median rent for Australia was $335, highest being in Sydney, Darwin, ACT and Perth. and more Sydney households spend more on the income than other states, other cities, followed by Brisbane, Melbourne and Adelaide. So our median rent in the Territory came in at $420 per week, not far behind Sydney, which was the top at $440. Melbourne was $350, Brisbane similar, Australia, as I mentioned, $335 a week. Again, as an affordability measure versus household income, you see that we've dropped off, and Hobart actually skyrocketed the other way in terms of the percentage of people spending more than 30% of their income on rent. So as I mentioned, more than half of Territory dwellings were rented, which is so much higher than the rest of the state, and this reflects more of our transit population and employment patterns. That's all I was going to talk about, I think. It's probably best if we talk a little bit about our products and then come back to questions at the end, maybe? All right, cool. I'll hand back to Tracy.
Steady. So what we've presented for you today is really just dipping the toe in the wealth that is the census data that has come out recently and more to come out in October. And it's just sort of to give you a highlight and a flavour of the different types of research or data investigations that you yourself can do either within your roles or within your educational studies or whatever it is you're doing. I really encourage you, if you haven't already, to go in and have a look and have a play with the data, have a see what your region is like, or if you're interested in a particular population or an ancestry group or whatever, go in and have a look and see what that looks like in Australia and in the Territory. And so in order for those of you who are not familiar with the vast number of products we've got for the census, I'll quickly run through those for you. So these are our key products that come out from the census. So on your left-hand side of the screen, they're more of our basic products. So you can sort of go in and the numbers are all there for you. You don't have to really do any calculations. So they are our quick stats products and our community profiles. And then once we move over to data packs and table builder and our longitudinal data sets, they're more for intermediate and advanced users around our census data. This census, as we do with every other census really, is that we put out quite a range of analytical articles. We put out some with the release that we did at the end of June, and they covered sort of, data summary sheets, snapshot of Australia, our cultural diversity, religion, our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and sex and gender diversity in the 2016 census. More analytical articles will come out this year and into next year as well, and we ask that you just sort of keep an eye on when those come out. And so what's coming up is that we'll put some further articles around sex and gender diversity in Australia, apartment living, same-sex couples, family characteristics, rural living in Australia's small towns, business ownership across Australia, and journey to work, and so articles around that sort of space. This is what our homepage looks like. You come into the ABS, you click the big census button, and then it'll take you to this screen, and this is quite easy to navigate here from the different types of products you might want to go in and have a look at. Sort of those quick stat products you can get to right away on that top left-hand corner, and you'll see a little box there too. You can also change the year that you want to look at as well if you want to go back and look at some earlier data on quick stats, or you can go to our community profiles because they have time series profiles in them as well. Some of the information on the right is really quite of interest to people. I often go and look at that top publication, which is Understanding Census Data. I often go in there. That's where a lot of our metrics are around our response rates for all the states and territories at the dwelling and the person level. It also provides a lot around our quality assurance and our data quality statements around a lot of the variables that we put out. And the other publication I look at quite often is our 2016 Census Data Dictionary, so that lets you know all the different data items that are available from the 2016 census. So this is what, once you sort of hit an area, so just assume I've typed in Northern Territory and hit go on that earlier screen. This is sort of the first thing that pops up if you're looking at quit stats, and it enables you to quickly and easily access that summary information about people, families and dwellings in an area, and you can compare that to the state or territory total as well as the Australian total as well. And when you pull up state and territory information, you're actually able to highlight key differences between the previous census as well, as they don't have some of those other comparisons. Community profiles provide a bit more of a comprehensive picture of our different areas, and I'm pretty sure these goes down to SA2 level only, again that nerdy statistical area that we have in terms of our regions. So we were presenting most of our data at SA4 or SA3 level today, so there's another level underneath that for you, and it really gives you more detailed information than what QuickStat has around our information about your area. For instance, we give you sort of top 5 country of birth. If you go into those community profiles, it will provide you quite a detailed list of the different numbers in country of birth of those regions. It also gives you those time series profiles, so you can see how some of those figures have changed over the last 2 censuses, so 2006 and 2011. And we also have our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander profiles as well. We have rationalised that compared to what we put out in 2011. So those of you who may be familiar with what we put out in 2011, we haven't put out the number of community profiles that we have because we have that information available in other sources. So we've just decided to rationalise what we put out. So I think we used to also put out working age population profiles and something else, but not doing it this time because the information is actually available in our data packs. Table Builder is another really useful tool as well, and even I've gotten on and had a play with that. And these are really for people who really want to tailor the type of analysis that they're doing, and those cross classifications that we've already predetermined in our other products aren't available and you want to do something a little bit different. That's when Table Builder comes in handy. We have also made it more accessible in 2016, so you no longer have to sign up and sign your life away to be able to have access. For our basic Table Builder, you're actually able to sign in as a guest and just be able to run some of those tables yourself. So what have we released and what's still to come? So obviously, end of June, 27th of June was our key data release, and that's where we release quite a lot of our products around what we call our first release, so all those counts of our population, the characteristics of our population. This October, we'll see us release the second lot of our data, and that is our occupation, our industry, our employment statistics, our detailed education statistics, population mobility, as well as our journey to work information. And from December, we'll sort of also be releasing other more comprehensive products. So our Australian Census longitudinal dataset is expected to be released in December. If not December, it'll be early in the new year. We also have other analytical products coming out in March next year. So those of you who are familiar with our socio-economic indexes for areas, our CEFA, that comes out next March, and as well as our remoteness index that will be added to our products next March as well. So while I'm here, I'm also going to do a bit of a plug for GovHack, and I know there's probably a few of you in the audience, and I might just get Nicole to quickly stand up. If you have any questions, anyone else? I'll let up the back there. If you have any questions, see those people. But I'll just sort of let you know that this on. So we're teaming up with GovHack to challenge everyday Australians to come up with ideas for an innovative 2016 data application or product. And the GovHack event that's on this weekend in Darwin and Alice, it's the first time that we've actually run this event in the NT, so they're all pretty excited about what's possible and what's coming up. So as I said, there's prize money, I am led to believe, for those that are judged some of the best applications and uses of 2016 census data. So if you want to know more information, see Nicole or the guys up the back, or alternatively have a look at that website and you should be able to get some more information.
Just to flag the dates from last year, so it starts Friday evening, starting doors open at the Darwin Innovation Hub in the city at 5:30 p.m. on Friday, 28th.
Brilliant. Sorry about that.
Right, this is the 2016 census.
Yeah, just a bit of cross promotion where we can, we're like Channel 7 and the tennis. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. I'll just introduce Caroline and Sarah here for you. If you could just stand up, ladies. Thank you. These are our data analysts, and they'll be sitting outside in the foyer. So if you want a bit more of a tour around our products or want to know how to be able to access our data, please go outside and see them. And while you're there, everyone, there's tea, coffee and biscuits too as for refreshments if you're hungry and need a bit of a pick-me-up. We will take questions, and Heather's got a microphone. So if you do have a question, can you please wait till you get the microphone before you speak, because we are live streaming this, shock horror. And so it just allows people listening through the live stream to be able to hear the question as well. So questions, anyone? There we have one right at the back.
You're probably aware that many of our people living in remote areas don't have access to the internet at the moment. It will happen eventually, but it's still happening. So is there an expectation that you're going to move to all web-based responses for the next census or the one after that?
It's definitely something that we're wanting to move towards in a general sense. The more online that we can get, the higher the data quality. And we do appreciate that collecting data remotely is not quite the same as collecting it in the middle of Sydney or Melbourne or even in Bendigo and Ballarat and Victoria. So what we're trying to look at are how can we still do that online without necessarily having that immediate upload requirement that happens.
There is also the fact that a lot of people aren't digitally literate or able to do that. So I think what I'm saying is please don't make it totally online or computer-based.
I think, look, it's something that our 2021 program are definitely looking at, but I still think the use of interviewers in our remote areas will go ahead, continue to be used and assist people in responding to the census.
G'day, I'm work from Aboriginal Medical Services Alliance of the Northern Territory. I've just been looking onto your website. Do you have any more health data that focusing on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander? Most recent one in particular, because the ones that I noticed there are 2012, 2014, and it's very specific to survey of the one that's provided by the national sector. But is there anything most recent up and coming?
When's the next? You've got this one. I'll hand over to Tony on that one.
I might jump in on that one. Great question, thank you. Actually, this October we actually have a pilot test of our next Indigenous health survey. The next survey is scheduled to go into the field next July, so it's actually a 2018-19. But yes, for now, unfortunately, the data you've got is the latest we have got. So, yeah.
Hi, just got a question. With all the information that the ABS has out and brings out every 4 years, is there an encouragement or support or partnership between all state and federal governments to use this in a productive manner looking forward, or is it just their more or less opportunity? So that's the question, narrowing the gap between the statistics and the way government uses it.
I find it a bit hard to talk on behalf of all other Commonwealth departments, but I know it's definitely something that the ABS is concerned with in terms of improving the statistical literacy and making sure that when policy is going forward, that they are using the correct statistics in the right way. I think, as Tony mentioned earlier in your presentation, with the retention of name and addresses and the increased potential in our data integration activities, it can really start to unlock quite a lot more statistics without having to go back and re-interview or re-survey people. So there is a greater capacity that we'll really be able to reuse a lot more information and have greater wealth of information around the health and well-being of the Australian population. Does that? maybe not. I can't talk on behalf of other Commonwealth departments, but if you wanted to.
Oh, no, just sort of clarifying the gap between states and federal governments using your statistical data in a more clarity way moving forward. I think seems to me in the past there's been an option to use it, but is the gap between them wanting to use it?
Yeah, I suppose it's hard to come up with general responses to something like that, but I know even from my experience, some of our largest Commonwealth agencies are already starting to mine data quite heavily and coming to us for greater insights into our data. So whereas Tracy's giving you a good snapshot of what some of our off-the-shelf products are, there's still a lot of capability for us to actually undertake data analytical works in conjunction with some of our other government partners. And from what I can see already, the demand's very strong. If anything, I suppose the challenge for us will be, particularly around data integration, is to actually be able to meet that demand.
Hi, Tony. Just a quick one on response rates. I think you said that the non-response rate in 2011 was fairly similar to 2016. Did you say that?
To make it clearer, I was saying the actual change is similar to the national drop. So we have had, for all intents and purposes, about a 1% drop in response. The territory dropped from 92 something to about 91 this census.
Right, and obviously you've got sectors of the population with high non-response rates. So I suppose my question is, in 2021, are you going to put some more funds in, or have you got any strategies to try and improve the response rate?
That's a really good question. Clearly there's always challenges with our funding envelope. But directly relevant to this question, and as clearly lots of people in this room are concerned with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander counts. The independent insurance panel that got put together, post the fund we had last August, with some very preeminent statisticians and business types. Whilst they gave us the green light to say that the census is still in line, the quality is aligned with previous censuses, they did actually pick a few areas where we needed to actually look for opportunities to improve. And some of our strategies around Indigenous and remote certainly came into that. So the ABS has heard that. I mean, we know from our own, I ran the operations up here, seeing the non-response or the undercount rates that not having improved from one census to the next. I mean, it's something that we still acknowledge we need to keep working on. A lot of it's around engagement, but it's not just engagement. There's talk here around access to technology. There's a whole host of things that we'd be looking at. For mine personally, I think a lot of it is about how we can bring more technology. Our remote operations this time were still predominantly pen and paper, whereas the mainstream processes were very much technically driven. But I think there's plenty of opportunities to extend that into our further aspects of our operations next time.
But it's probably not going to be, technology is probably not going to be the key to answering this, is it? It's going to be more enumerators and people on the ground doing those face-to-face interviewing. So if you want to address it, you're really going to have to get more funds specifically for that, aren't you? If you want to address it.
There will need to be a different apportionment of how we spend our money, and we got a fair injection last census, and we pretty much rolled out a similar recipe this census. but there's always going to be room for improvement, and it is a combination of engagement and process. But technology could still help us get our processes more efficient and understand what's happening. You know, when you're running 100 remote teams out of Darwin, it's very hard to keep track of them without that sort of technology. So I think in the future, we can look to how we can confront other data sets in that field enumeration stage.
It just could be a matter of having smarter teams on the ground. You can have the technology for those areas who have access to it, but having translators or having the apps in language of the particular regions. So, you know, are people doing cultural awareness training? Do they have the capacity to clearly communicate with people from a foreign culture? Because Indigenous people, we're foreign to non-Indigenous Australia, and it doesn't mean that the people who go out and work on communities with their heart on their sleeve trying to do the right thing are communicating effectively though, and getting the information, basically explaining to people, because a lot of Indigenous people are weary of programs. They're wary of people coming out and saying, we're going to do all this stuff with no clear understanding of what that means. What are the outcomes from this for our community? For me to take the time to sit and talk to you who don't understand my language and I don't understand yours. So making it clear to the communities, we're doing this so that we can support possibly infrastructure in the future, that we can show there's overcrowding here, that you need better roads, and the only way we can do that is by showing your population size. So having those clear understanding to the community and having clear communication pathways.
Really well said. Totally aligned with what you're saying. Our intent was to try and meet most of those ideals that you put forward in terms of well-trained field staff, cultural awareness training and the like. We did do all that, but again, you're still actually restricted to the capability of the people that you can find to do the job. We still had the same commitment to employing within community where we could. So we had a process of trying to employ not only facilitators that could actually help, send people around the community and understand what's happening, but also Indigenous, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander interviewers as well. But to be fair, that did drop off this census. We had less numbers than last. It's something for us to unpack going forward, whether or not that's an engagement issue, whether it's a remuneration issue, etc. There's a whole range of things that could be impacting on that, but clearly we had areas where we really struggled to get that engagement. And you're right, you need people, and the right people. Sorry for people at the front, we're sort of winding down to get the best.
Where was it?
Yeah, Tony, we'll go to Tony.
Hi, Tony and Tracy. Thank you very much for a great presentation. We heard a bit earlier about non-response, and I think we've seen some not stated data, and we've heard one or two mentions of imputing. And I wonder whether you might say a little bit more about that, because I don't know that people are very aware of how big that is and what it really means, and the overall impact of that it may have on quality of the NT data in particular.
Yeah. Happy to kick off, and Tracy might want to back me up. But great question. In layman's terms, when we have a non-contact dwelling for whatever reason, we then will actually impute people into that dwelling for the purpose of our count. And that's generally done by a statistical process where we actually take a donor record from somewhere else with a similar sort of demographic characteristics of the dwelling that we need to put people into, and we impute some basic variables in terms of age, sex, usual address,
Registered
marital status, but we don't impute Indigenous status. Now you're right, that actually has a fair impact in the territory. So when we've got 8% of our non-responding dwellings that we've imputed into, we haven't imputed Indigenous status. And we already know just on the broad level statistics that well over a quarter of Territorians are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. So there is an impact in that cohort. There are ways in which that then gets adjusted in our estimate resident population through the confrontation through our post-enumeration survey, but generally that is at state level. So whilst we can say we've got an accurate count in ERP at state level, when you get down to lower jurisdictions, you're right, the impact is that you won't have as high a quality count of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders.
Yeah, if I could just follow on that. The point I think people need to realise is that these imputed records, and in the Territory, it's around about 10% of all the records actually sit in that census data file. But the only information we have on these 10% of people are a sex variable, an age variable, and a marital state variable. Yeah. And those have, they've been essentially calculated from neighbouring records. Yeah. So besides the people that are not counted at all in the census and in the Territory, that's actually around about 7 or 8. I don't mean the net amount. The 7 or 8% of not counted at all. There's this 10 or 11% who are imputed. So there really is almost 20% of the people in the Territory whose records are either not there in the census file or are very, very shallowly recorded. Yeah. And that's an important a factor that we need to bear in mind when we're talking about Northern Territory in particular, data quality issues from the census.
Yeah, and just to let people know, we do put that information out with all our products as well. So you will be, if you wanted to, you could exclude those imputed people when you're doing your analysis, or you can take those out of your analysis. So that information is all available in our data dictionary, should you want to have a look at all that sort of stuff. Cole?
Thanks, Tony. Thanks, Tracy. This question's from the Department of Housing and Community Development. So they're wondering, Tony, homelessness estimates, when they might be released, NT, national, and some more details about that coming forward.
Yeah, sure. I think one of Tracy's last slides suggested around December, but we're actually already commenced that work. It'll be the late October, November most likely, release for that data, which is pretty much aligned. I think last census was mid-November, about the same sort of timeline. Looking like we might be done. All right. Yeah. Well, thanks very much for putting up with us today. It was, and thanks for your really good questions. It was actually great to hear.